Captain David Thompson pulled his car into the private aviation parking lot, just as the morning sun painted the sky orange and pink. He had been flying planes for over 20 years, and today felt like any other day. At 45 years old, David had learned to wake up early and prepare carefully for every flight. His crisp navy blue pilot uniform was perfectly pressed, his black shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his pilot cap sat at just the right angle. The private terminal was much quieter than regular airports. Here, wealthy people kept their personal jets and everything moved smoothly and quickly. David loved flying from places like this because there was less chaos and fewer delays. Today's flight was special, though. He was taking some important business people to a meeting in another state, and they were paying very well for his services. David walked toward the beautiful white and silver jet that sat gleaming on the tarmac. The Gulfstream G650 was one of the most expensive private jets in the world, worth over $60 million. He had flown this exact plane many times before, and it still amazed him how smooth and powerful it was. The owner trusted him completely, which meant everything to David. As he approached the aircraft, David noticed a security guard standing near the entrance to the terminal. The man looked to be in his early 30s with short brown hair and a serious expression on his face. His name tag read Officer Stevens. David had never seen this guard before, but that wasn't unusual. Security staff changed often at private airports. David pulled out his leather briefcase and began walking toward the plane's stairs. He needed to do his pre-flight inspection and make sure everything was ready for departure in 2 hours. His passengers would arrive soon, and David prided himself on being completely prepared. "Hey, you there," Officer Stevens called out loudly. "Stop right where you are." David turned around surprised. He smiled politely and waited for the officer to approach him. Maybe there was some new security procedure he needed to know about. "What are you doing near that aircraft?" Officer Stevens asked, his voice sharp and unfriendly. "Good morning, officer," David replied calmly. "I'm Captain Thompson. I'm here to prepare for today's flight. We're scheduled to depart at 10:30. Officer Stevens looked David up and down slowly, his eyes filled with doubt. "You're the pilot?" he asked, as if the idea was impossible to believe. "Yes, sir. I've been flying for over 20 years. This is my scheduled flight today." David reached into his briefcase and pulled out his pilot's license and other important papers. "Here are my credentials if you'd like to see them." But Officer Stevens didn't even look at the papers. Instead, he crossed his arms and shook his head. "I don't think so. That's a $60 million jet, and I seriously doubt you're qualified to fly it." David felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He had experienced this kind of treatment before, but it never got easier. People sometimes looked at him and made quick decisions about what he could or couldn't do, based on the color of his skin. "Officer Stevens," David said, reading the name tag, "I understand you're doing your job, but I really am the pilot. If you look at these papers, you'll see my FAA license, my airline transport pilot certificate, and my type rating for this specific aircraft. Anyone can fake documents these days," Officer Stevens replied, without even glancing at David's paperwork. "I've never seen you around here before, and I know all the regular pilots. Sir, I fly from this airport at least twice a month. I've been coming here for 3 years. David kept his voice steady and professional, just like he had learned in the military. "Perhaps you could call the Flight Operations Office. They have all my information on file." Officer Stevens laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you need to leave this area immediately. Private aircraft are for authorized personnel only." "I am authorized personnel," David said firmly. "I'm a licensed commercial pilot with over 15,000 flight hours. I've flown everything from small training planes to large passenger jets. This aircraft belongs to a client who specifically requested me for this flight." "Right," Officer Stevens said sarcastically. "And I suppose you just happened to get dressed up in a pilot costume to try to steal a jet worth more than most people's houses." David felt his patience beginning to slip, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting angry would only make things worse. "Officer, I'm not trying to steal anything. I'm here to do my job. If you have concerns about my identity, please call your supervisor or the airport manager. They can verify everything." "I don't need to call anyone," Officer Stevens shot back. "I can see what's going on here. You think you can just walk onto private property wearing a uniform, and people will believe you're somebody important?" Other people around the terminal began to notice the conversation. A few maintenance workers stopped what they were doing to watch. A woman in a business suit slowed down as she walked past, clearly listening to what was happening. David realized this situation was getting out of hand quickly. He pulled out his phone and showed Officer Stevens a photo of himself in the cockpit of the same jet they were standing next to. "This is me flying this exact aircraft last month," David explained. "I can show you flight logs, passenger records, everything you need to verify my identity." But Officer Stevens barely looked at the phone. Photo editing is easy these days. Anyone can fake pictures. Then what would convince you? David asked, genuinely puzzled. "What kind of proof would you accept?" "Honestly, nothing you could show me would convince me that you belong here," Officer Stevens said bluntly. "This is a high-security area for very wealthy people. I don't think you understand how much money we're talking about here." David understood perfectly well. He had grown up poor and worked incredibly hard to earn his pilot's license and build his reputation. Every flight was important to him, and he never took his responsibilities lightly. "Officer Stevens, I respect that you take security seriously. That's important. But I'm telling you the truth. I'm Captain David Thompson, and I'm scheduled to fly this aircraft in less than 2 hours. My passengers are counting on me." "Your passengers?" Officer Stevens raised his eyebrows. "Who exactly are these passengers?" David hesitated. His clients valued their privacy, and he wasn't supposed to discuss their travel plans with unauthorized people. "I'm sorry, but that information is confidential. Client privacy is very important in this business." "How convenient," Officer Stevens said. "You can't prove who you are, and you can't tell me who hired you. This whole story sounds made up to me." The tension in the air was thick now. David could feel people staring at them from across the terminal. He knew that soon someone would probably start recording this confrontation with their phone, and that would make everything even more complicated. "Officer, I'm going to ask one more time. Please call someone in authority who can verify my credentials. I don't want this situation to get any worse than it already has." But Officer Stevens was already reaching for his radio. "This is Stevens at the private terminal. I need backup for a possible trespassing situation." David's heart sank as he heard Officer Stevens call for backup. This simple misunderstanding was about to become something much bigger. He took a deep breath and tried to think clearly. In his 20 years of flying, he had learned that staying calm under pressure was the most important skill any pilot could have. "Officer Stevens," David said quietly, "I really think we can solve this without involving more people. Why don't you just make one phone call to verify who I am?" But Officer Stevens ignored him completely. He was already walking in circles, talking into his radio like he had caught a dangerous criminal. "Yeah, we've got a situation here. Some guy in a pilot costume trying to gain access to one of the expensive jets. Claims he's supposed to fly it." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. A pilot costume. He looked down at his uniform, which had cost him nearly $800 and was made by the same company that supplied uniforms to major airlines. His name was even embroidered on the chest pocket, along with his airline transport pilot wings that he had earned through years of hard work and training. A small crowd was starting to gather. 2 maintenance workers had stopped pushing their equipment cart and were now openly staring. A woman in an expensive business suit had paused near the terminal entrance, pretending to check her phone while clearly listening to every word. Even the fuel truck driver had slowed down to see what was happening. David felt embarrassed and frustrated, but he forced himself to remain professional. He had learned long ago that losing his temper would only make people believe negative things about him. His father had taught him that lesson when he was just a teenager. "Sir," David tried again, "my name is Captain David Thompson. I have over 15,000 flight hours and a perfect safety record. I flew combat missions in Afghanistan and Iraq before becoming a commercial pilot. I'm not trying to cause any trouble here." Officer Stevens finally finished his radio conversation and turned back to David. "Combat missions? Now you're claiming to be some kind of war hero too?" "I'm not claiming anything," David replied firmly. "I'm telling you facts that you can easily verify. I served in the Air Force for 12 years before starting my civilian flying career." "Sure you did," Officer Stevens said with a smirk. "Let me guess, you were probably a colonel or a general, right?" David pulled out his wallet and showed Officer Stevens his military veteran identification card. "I was a major. I flew C-130 transport planes and did 3 tours overseas." Officer Stevens glanced at the card for maybe 2 seconds before handing it back. These things are easy to fake too. You can buy military ID cards online these days. David stared at the man in disbelief. What would it take to convince him? He had shown his pilot's license, his FAA certificates, his type rating for this specific aircraft, a photograph of himself flying the plane, and now his military veteran card. But Officer Stevens seemed determined not to believe any of it. "Officer, what exactly would prove to you that I'm telling the truth?" David asked. "Honestly?" "Nothing," Officer Stevens replied. "I've been working security for 8 years, and I know when something doesn't add up. Rich people don't hire pilots who look like you to fly their $60 million jets." The words hit David like a punch to the stomach. There it was, out in the open. Officer Stevens wasn't questioning David's credentials because they looked fake. He was questioning them because David was a black man, and Officer Stevens couldn't believe that a black man could be trusted with something so valuable. David had faced this kind of thinking before, but it never stopped hurting. He remembered when he was trying to buy his first house and the real estate agent kept showing him cheaper properties in different neighborhoods, even though David had already been approved for a much larger loan. He remembered when he went to buy his car, and the salesman kept trying to steer him toward used vehicles instead of the new one he wanted to purchase with cash. But this was different. This was his career, his reputation, and his livelihood all being questioned in public. 2 security guards arrived in a golf cart, and Officer Stevens waved them over. "Thanks for coming, guys. We've got someone here who claims to be the pilot of that Gulfstream over there. He's got some fake papers and everything." David watched as the 2 new guards looked him up and down with suspicious expressions. One of them was an older man with gray hair who looked like he had been working security for many years. The other was younger, probably in his 20s, with a nervous expression on his face. "What's your name?" the older guard asked David. "Captain David Thompson," David replied for what felt like the 10th time. "I'm scheduled to fly that aircraft this morning." The older guard, whose name tag read Wilson, looked at David's uniform more carefully. "That's a nice uniform. Where did you get it?" "It's regulation airline pilot uniform from Aero Phoenix Uniforms," David explained. "The same company that makes uniforms for Delta, United, and American Airlines." Guard Wilson nodded slowly. "I know that company. Those uniforms are expensive and they don't sell them to just anyone." He looked at Officer Stevens. "Did you check his credentials?" "He's got a bunch of fake documents," Officer Stevens replied quickly. "Driver's license, pilot's license, some kind of military card. All fake." "Did you actually examine them?" Wilson asked. Officer Stevens shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no, but anyone can fake that stuff these days." Wilson turned to David. "May I see your pilot's license?" David handed over his documents gratefully. Finally, someone was willing to actually look at his paperwork instead of just dismissing it. Wilson studied the license carefully, checking the official seals and signatures. He looked at David's photo and compared it to his face. He checked the expiration date and the type ratings listed on the certificate. "This looks legitimate to me," Wilson said after a few minutes. "The security features are all there and everything matches up." "Those can be faked," Officer Stevens insisted. "Maybe," Wilson replied, "but it would be expensive and difficult. Why would someone go to all that trouble just to hang around an airport?" The younger guard, whose name tag said Rodriguez, had been quiet up until now. "Excuse me," he said to David, "but didn't I see you here a couple weeks ago? You were flying that same plane." David felt a wave of relief. "Yes, that's right. I fly for Mrs. Hamilton fairly regularly, usually twice a month." "Mrs. Hamilton?" Wilson's eyebrows went up. "You fly for Catherine Hamilton?" "Yes, sir. She's been my client for almost 3 years now." Wilson whistled softly. "Mrs. Hamilton doesn't mess around when it comes to her pilots. I heard she does extensive background checks and only hires the best." Officer Stevens looked frustrated. "Look, I don't care who he claims to work for. Something about this whole situation feels wrong to me." "What feels wrong about it?" Wilson asked. Officer Stevens couldn't seem to find the right words. It doesn't seem right, okay?" By now, the small crowd of onlookers had grown larger. David could see people pointing and whispering. Someone definitely had their phone out, probably recording the whole thing. This was exactly what he had been afraid of. "Gentlemen," David said, "I understand you're all trying to do your jobs, but I have passengers arriving in about an hour, and I need to complete my pre-flight inspection. Could we please resolve this quickly?" "What passengers?" Officer Stevens demanded. "I'm not at liberty to discuss my passengers' identities," David replied. "Client confidentiality is very important in this business." "How convenient," Officer Stevens muttered. Wilson looked back and forth between Officer Stevens and David. "Stevens, why don't you call the flight operations office and verify his story? That would settle this whole thing." "I don't need to call anyone," Officer Stevens said stubbornly. "I know what I see." The tension was getting thicker by the minute, and David realized this situation was about to get much worse. David could feel his carefully maintained patience starting to crack. He had been dealing with this situation for almost 30 minutes now, and his departure time was getting closer. His passengers would arrive soon, and they expected him to be ready. These were important business people who paid well for reliable service, and David had never been late for a flight in his entire career. "Look," David said, pulling out his phone. "Let me call Mrs. Hamilton right now. She can confirm everything I'm telling you." "Don't you dare make any phone calls," Officer Stevens snapped. "For all I know, you've got some accomplice who's going to pretend to be this Hamilton person." Wilson shook his head in frustration. "Stevens, you're being ridiculous. This man has shown us legitimate documentation, and Rodriguez even recognizes him from previous flights." "I'm just doing my job," Officer Stevens replied defensively. "Better safe than sorry when we're talking about $60 million worth of aircraft." David's phone rang and he looked at the screen. It was his dispatcher calling about the flight. This was not good. If he didn't answer, they would start worrying that something had gone wrong. "I need to take this call," David said. "It's about today's flight." "No phone calls," Officer Stevens repeated firmly. "Sir, this is my job. People are counting on me." David answered the phone anyway. "Hello, this is Captain Thompson." "David, thank goodness," came the voice of Linda, his dispatcher. "I was starting to worry. Your passengers called and said they're running about 15 minutes early. They'll be there in 45 minutes instead of an hour." "I understand," David said carefully, aware that everyone was listening. "There's been a small delay with security here, but I'm working to resolve it." "Security delay? What kind of delay?" Linda sounded concerned. David looked at Officer Stevens, who was glaring at him suspiciously. "Just some routine verification procedures. Nothing serious." "Okay, well, make sure everything is sorted out quickly. You know how Mrs. Hamilton feels about punctuality." "I understand completely. I'll call you back in a few minutes." David hung up the phone and looked at the security guards. "My passengers are arriving early. I really need to get to my aircraft and complete my pre-flight checks." "What was that about Mrs. Hamilton feeling strongly about punctuality?" Wilson asked. "Mrs. Hamilton values professionalism and reliability above everything else," David explained. "She's never tolerated lateness or excuses from anyone who works for her. That's why she's been successful in business." Officer Stevens laughed mockingly. "Oh, so now you're claiming to know Catherine Hamilton personally? That woman is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She owns half the commercial real estate in the city." "I don't claim to know her personally," David replied calmly. "I'm her pilot. It's a professional relationship built on trust and reliability." "Right," Officer Stevens said sarcastically. "And I suppose she just randomly decided to hire you out of all the qualified pilots in the world." David felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, but he forced it down. "Actually, she didn't randomly hire me. I was recommended to her by Colonel Peterson, who was my commanding officer in the Air Force. He and Mrs. Hamilton's late husband served together in Vietnam." This was the first time David had mentioned Colonel Peterson, and he could see that Wilson was paying close attention. "Colonel Peterson?" Wilson asked. "You mean Colonel James Peterson?" "Yes," David replied, surprised. "Do you know him?" "My brother served under Colonel Peterson in Germany," Wilson said slowly. "He always said Peterson was one of the finest officers he ever met." Tough but fair, and he never recommended anyone unless they were absolutely the best. Officer Stevens looked frustrated. So what? Anyone can drop names. Actually, Wilson said, that's pretty specific. Colonel Peterson has a reputation for being very selective about who he recommends. If he vouched for this man, that means something. David felt a small surge of hope. Maybe Wilson could help him resolve this situation before it got any worse. Officer Wilson, David said. I served under Colonel Peterson for 6 years. He taught me that integrity and professionalism are more important than anything else. He's the reason I've never had a single incident or complaint in my entire flying career. What aircraft did you fly in the service? Wilson asked. C-130 Hercules transport planes, David replied immediately. Mainly cargo runs and troop transport. I did supply drops in some pretty dangerous areas. Wilson nodded approvingly. Those are tough aircraft to master. Not everyone can handle a C-130 in combat conditions. The C-130 taught me to be ready for anything, David said. Weather, mechanical problems, hostile territory. After flying in those conditions, civilian flying feels almost easy. Officer Stevens was getting more agitated by the minute. This is all just talk. Anyone can read about military aircraft online and pretend they know about them. Stevens, Wilson said sharply, this man knows details that you can't just read online. He's talking about real experience. Rodriguez, the younger guard, had been quietly listening to everything. Sir, he said to David, didn't you help out during that emergency landing last year, when that small plane had engine trouble? David remembered the incident clearly. Yes, that was me. A Cessna pilot was having engine problems and couldn't reach the control tower. I happened to be here preparing for a flight, so I helped guide him down using my radio. That's right, Rodriguez said excitedly. I was here that day. You probably saved that guy's life. He was panicking pretty badly. Any pilot would have done the same thing, David said modestly. No, sir, Rodriguez replied. There were other pilots here that day, but you were the one who stepped up and took charge. You knew exactly what to do. Wilson was nodding as he listened to this story. I remember hearing about that incident. The pilot you helped said afterward that someone with military training had talked him through the landing. Officer Stevens looked like he was about to explode. This is all just coincidence and made-up stories. I'm calling the police. The police? Wilson asked in disbelief. Stevens, what exactly do you think this man has done wrong? He's trespassing on private property and attempting to gain unauthorized access to an aircraft. Officer Stevens replied stiffly. But we've established that he has proper credentials and legitimate access, Wilson pointed out. I haven't established anything, Officer Stevens shot back. I think all his paperwork is fake, and I think he's running some kind of scam. David realized that no amount of evidence was going to convince Officer Stevens. The man had made up his mind based on his prejudices, and nothing would change it. Gentlemen, David said quietly, I appreciate that Officer Wilson and Officer Rodriguez are trying to be fair, but I can see that Officer Stevens has concerns that won't be resolved by anything I can show him. Perhaps we should wait for someone in higher authority to sort this out. Higher authority? Officer Stevens asked. Well, Mrs. Hamilton will be arriving soon to check on the flight preparations, David said. She always likes to personally inspect the aircraft before important trips. I'm sure she can clear up any confusion about who I am and why I'm here. Officer Stevens's face went pale. Mrs. Hamilton is coming here? Today? Yes, David replied. She should be here within the next 20 minutes. Wilson whistled softly. Catherine Hamilton doesn't come to the airport very often. When she does show up personally, it usually means the flight is extremely important. That's right, David said. Today's passengers are very significant business partners of hers. She wants everything to be perfect. Officer Stevens was starting to look nervous for the first time since this whole situation began. David could see him trying to figure out what to do next. Maybe, Rodriguez suggested quietly, we should just wait for Mrs. Hamilton to arrive and let her sort this whole thing out. No, Officer Stevens said firmly. I'm not going to let this man manipulate us by claiming that Catherine Hamilton is about to show up. It's just another lie. But David could see the doubt creeping into Officer Stevens's eyes. For the first time, the security guard was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he had made a terrible mistake. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours to David as he stood there surrounded by security guards and curious onlookers. Officer Stevens had spent most of that time pacing back and forth, muttering into his radio and making phone calls to his supervisor. Wilson and Rodriguez had tried to convince him to let David proceed with his pre-flight inspection, but Stevens refused to budge. The crowd around them had grown even larger. David could see airport workers whispering to each other and pointing in his direction. A few people had their phones out, clearly recording everything that was happening. This was exactly the kind of public embarrassment that could damage his reputation and hurt his career. David checked his watch nervously. His passengers would arrive in less than 30 minutes, and he hadn't even started his pre-flight checks yet. Mrs. Hamilton expected everything to be perfect, and David had never let her down before. The thought of disappointing her made his stomach twist with anxiety. "There," Officer Stevens said suddenly, pointing toward the parking area. "See that black Mercedes pulling up? That's probably one of your accomplices coming to help with this scam." David looked where Stevens was pointing and felt a wave of relief wash over him. The sleek black Mercedes S-Class was exactly the car he had been hoping to see. Mrs. Hamilton always arrived in that vehicle when she came to check on important flights. "That's not an accomplice," David said quietly. "That's Mrs. Hamilton." Officer Stevens laughed. "Right, and I suppose you think some actress you hired is going to step out of that car and pretend to be Catherine Hamilton." Wilson and Rodriguez watched nervously as the Mercedes came to a stop near the terminal entrance. They both knew what Mrs. Hamilton looked like from newspaper photos and television interviews. If this really was her, Officer Stevens was about to face some serious consequences. The driver got out first and opened the rear door. A woman in her early 60s stepped out, wearing an elegant navy blue business suit and carrying a leather briefcase. She had silver hair pulled back in a perfect bun, and even from a distance her presence commanded attention. This was clearly someone used to being in charge. "Oh no," Rodriguez whispered. "That's really her." Mrs. Catherine Hamilton looked around the terminal area and immediately noticed the crowd gathered near her aircraft. Her expression changed from calm to concerned as she walked briskly toward the group. "Good morning, Captain Thompson," she called out as she approached. "I hope everything is ready for our departure." Officer Stevens's face went completely white. This woman knew David by name, and she was clearly expecting him to be here. "Good morning, Mrs. Hamilton," David replied, relief evident in his voice. "We've had a small delay with security procedures, but I'm confident we can resolve it quickly." Mrs. Hamilton's sharp eyes took in the scene immediately. She saw David surrounded by security guards, the crowd of onlookers, and the tension in everyone's faces. "What kind of security delay?" she asked, her voice taking on a colder tone. Wilson stepped forward nervously. "Ma'am, there's been a misunderstanding about Captain Thompson's authorization to access your aircraft." "A misunderstanding?" Mrs. Hamilton's eyebrows rose dangerously. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Officer Stevens tried to step forward and take control. "Mrs. Hamilton, I'm Officer Stevens, Airport Security. We detained this individual because he was attempting to gain unauthorized access to your aircraft. We believe he may be involved in some kind of theft attempt." Mrs. Hamilton stared at Officer Stevens for a long moment, and David could see the anger building in her eyes. When Catherine Hamilton was angry, smart people got out of her way. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," she said slowly. "You detained Captain Thompson, who has been my personal pilot for almost 3 years, because you thought he was trying to steal my aircraft?" "Well, yes, ma'am, but we couldn't verify his identity," Officer Stevens stammered. "Did you examine his credentials?" Mrs. Hamilton asked. "He had some documents, but anyone can fake those things nowadays," Officer Stevens replied weakly. Mrs. Hamilton turned to Wilson. "Did you look at his credentials?" "Yes, ma'am," Wilson replied. "They appeared to be completely legitimate. FAA pilot's license, type rating for this aircraft, military veteran identification, everything checked out. And yet Officer Stevens decided to ignore your assessment and continue detaining my pilot?" "Yes, ma'am. He seemed convinced that Captain Thompson was running some kind of scam." Mrs. Hamilton's face was getting redder by the minute. David had seen her angry before, but never quite like this. "Officer Stevens," she said, her voice sharp as a blade, "Captain Thompson is not just my pilot. He is one of the most qualified and trusted aviators I have ever worked with. He was recommended to me personally by Colonel James Peterson, who served with my late husband in Vietnam." Officer Stevens tried to interrupt. "Ma'am, I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Mrs. Hamilton cut him off. "Your job is to provide security, not to harass qualifier." Ed professionals based on your personal prejudices. The word prejudices hung in the air like a thunderclap. Everyone within hearing distance knew exactly what Mrs. Hamilton was implying, and Officer Stevens's face turned bright red. "I don't have any prejudices," he protested. "I treat everyone equally." "Do you?" Mrs. Hamilton asked coldly. "Tell me, Officer Stevens, how many other pilots have you detained and questioned in the past year?" "Well, that is, how many white pilots have you stopped and accused of trying to steal aircraft?" Officer Stevens couldn't answer. The truth was obvious to everyone watching. Mrs. Hamilton turned to David with a concerned expression. "Captain, I am deeply sorry for this treatment. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "No, ma'am, I'm fine," David replied. "Just frustrated that we've lost valuable preparation time." "How long have you been dealing with this harassment?" David checked his watch. "About 50 minutes, ma'am." Mrs. Hamilton whirled back to face Officer Stevens. 50 minutes? You've wasted 50 minutes of my pilot's time with this nonsense?" "Ma'am, I was just being cautious." "Cautious?" Mrs. Hamilton's voice rose sharply. "Or discriminatory?" The crowd around them had grown silent. Everyone was listening to every word of this confrontation. Mrs. Hamilton pulled out her phone. "I'm calling airport management immediately. This kind of behavior is completely unacceptable." "Please, Mrs. Hamilton," Officer Stevens pleaded. "There's no need to involve management. It was just a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding that lasted 50 minutes and involved detaining one of the most qualified pilots in the industry. Mrs. Hamilton shot back. A misunderstanding that happened despite Captain Thompson providing proper credentials and identification. David watched as Mrs. Hamilton dialed a number on her phone. He knew she had connections throughout the airport authority and city government. When Catherine Hamilton made a complaint, people listened. "Hello, Robert. This is Catherine Hamilton. I'm at the private terminal, and I need you down here immediately. One of your security officers has been harassing my pilot for almost an hour." "Yes, harassing? Racial harassment. No, I'm not exaggerating. I want this officer suspended pending a full investigation." Officer Stevens looked like he was about to be sick. David almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Mrs. Hamilton ended her call and looked around at the crowd that had gathered. "I want everyone here to understand something. Captain David Thompson is one of the finest pilots I have ever worked with. He has an impeccable safety record, extensive military experience, and my complete trust. Anyone who questions his qualifications or his right to be here is questioning my judgment." She turned back to Officer Stevens one more time. "Your supervisor will be here in 5 minutes. I suggest you use that time to think about how you're going to explain your actions." David felt a mixture of relief and vindication washing over him. Finally, someone with authority had arrived to set the record straight. But he also knew this situation was far from over. Robert Martinez, the airport operations manager, arrived in less than 5 minutes, just as Mrs. Hamilton had predicted. David could see him walking quickly across the tarmac, his face serious and concerned. Robert was a man in his 50s who had been managing airport operations for over 15 years, and David had worked with him many times before. "Mrs. Hamilton," Robert said as he approached, slightly out of breath, "I came as quickly as I could. What exactly happened here?" Mrs. Hamilton's expression was still ice cold. "Robert, your security officer detained my pilot for nearly an hour, despite him having proper credentials and authorization. Officer Stevens accused Captain Thompson of attempting to steal my aircraft." Robert's face went pale as he looked around at the crowd of people still watching the situation unfold. This was exactly the kind of incident that could damage the airport's reputation with wealthy clients. "Captain Thompson," Robert said, turning to David, "I sincerely apologize for whatever you've experienced here. You've been flying from this facility for years without any issues." "Thank you, Mr. Martinez," David replied. "I understand that security is important, but this situation went far beyond reasonable safety procedures." Robert turned to Officer Stevens, who was looking more uncomfortable by the minute. "Stevens, I want to hear your side of this story. Why did you detain Captain Thompson?" "Sir, I was just doing my job," Officer Stevens said defensively. I saw someone approaching an expensive aircraft and I wanted to verify their authorization. Did you examine his credentials? Well, yes, but anyone can fake documents these days. Did the documents appear to be legitimate? Officer Stevens hesitated. I couldn't be sure. Wilson stepped forward. Sir, if I may, I examined Captain Thompson's credentials myself. They appeared to be completely authentic. FAA license, type rating, military veteran ID, everything was in order. So Officer Wilson confirmed that the documentation was legitimate, but you still chose to detain Captain Thompson? I had concerns about the situation, Officer Stevens said weakly. Robert looked around at the crowd and then back at Mrs. Hamilton. Ma'am, could we discuss this privately? No, Mrs. Hamilton said firmly. This happened in public, and it should be addressed in public. Captain Thompson's reputation was questioned in front of all these people, and I want them to hear how this is resolved. David appreciated Mrs. Hamilton's support, but he was also getting worried about time. His passengers would arrive in less than 20 minutes, and he still hadn't completed his pre-flight inspection. Mrs. Hamilton, David said quietly, I really do need to prepare the aircraft. Our passengers will be here soon. Of course, Captain, she replied. Mr. Martinez, I want Officer Stevens removed from this area immediately so Captain Thompson can do his job. Officer Stevens, Robert said, you're suspended pending a full investigation. Please report to my office after your shift ends today. Officer Stevens' face went completely white. Suspended? Sir, I was just trying to protect airport property. By ignoring legitimate credentials and detaining a qualified pilot for an hour, Robert asked. Stevens, this is exactly the kind of incident that could result in a discrimination lawsuit against the airport. The word discrimination made Officer Stevens flinch. He looked around at all the people watching him, many of whom were now shaking their heads in disapproval. I want a written report on my desk by tomorrow morning, Robert continued. And I'm ordering mandatory sensitivity training for all security staff. This cannot happen again. Mrs. Hamilton wasn't finished. Robert, I also want assurance that Captain Thompson will receive a formal apology from the airport authority. His professional reputation was damaged today through no fault of his own. Absolutely, Robert agreed. Captain Thompson, you have the airport's full apology, and I'll put that in writing as well. David nodded gratefully, then looked at his watch again. I really do need to start my pre-flight checks now. Of course, Mrs. Hamilton said. Let's get out of Captain Thompson's way so he can prepare for our departure. As the crowd began to disperse, Rodriguez approached David. Captain, I just want to say I'm sorry about all this. Officer Stevens was wrong and I should have spoken up sooner. Thank you, Rodriguez, David replied. I appreciate your honesty during this whole situation. Wilson also came over to shake David's hand. Sir, it was an honor to meet you. I'm sorry my colleague put you through this ordeal. Thank you, Officer Wilson. Your fairness and professionalism made a difficult situation bearable. Officer Stevens stood alone now, looking defeated and embarrassed. Several airport workers were avoiding eye contact with him as they walked past. David almost felt sorry for the man, but then he remembered the humiliation and stress of the past hour. Mrs. Hamilton walked with David toward the aircraft. Captain, I want you to know that this incident will be reported to the appropriate authorities. What happened today was completely unacceptable. I appreciate your support, Mrs. Hamilton. It means everything to me. You've been flying for me for 3 years, and you've never given me a single reason to doubt your competence or integrity. The idea that someone would question your qualifications based on anything other than your professional record is disgusting. David began his pre-flight inspection, checking the aircraft's exterior, engines, and control surfaces. Mrs. Hamilton watched approvingly as he went through his careful, methodical process.
This is why I hired you, she said. Your attention to detail and professionalism are exactly what I need when I'm trusting you with my life and the lives of my business partners. 20 minutes later, David's passengers arrived. They were 3.
Executives from a major investment firm who were flying to close an important business deal. They had no idea what had happened earlier, and David intended to keep it that way. His job was to provide them with safe, comfortable transportation, not to burden them with his personal problems. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, David said as they boarded the aircraft.
I'm Captain Thompson, and I'll be flying you to Chicago today. We have beautiful weather for our flight, and I expect a smooth journey. As they settled into their seats, Mrs. Hamilton pulled David aside. Captain, I've been thinking about expanding my business operations.
I'm going to need more flights, which means I'll need additional pilots. Would you be interested in helping me build a small fleet and training other pilots to my standards? David's eyes widened. This was an incredible opportunity that could transform his career. Mrs. Hamilton, I would be honored to help you with that project. Good. We'll discuss the details after today's flight. But I want you to know that what happened today only reinforced my confidence in you. The way you handled that situation with dignity and professionalism showed me exactly the kind of person I want representing my company. As David started the engines and prepared for takeoff, he reflected on the events of the morning. It had been one of the most challenging and frustrating experiences of his career, but it had also shown him that there were people like Mrs. Hamilton, Wilson, and Rodriguez who were willing to stand up for what was right. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the morning sky, and David felt a sense of peace returning. This was what he loved about flying. Up here, above the clouds, there was only the sky, the aircraft, and his skill as a pilot. Nothing else mattered. 3 hours later, they landed safely in Chicago, and his passengers thanked him for an excellent flight. Mrs. Hamilton was already making plans for their next trip, and David knew that despite the morning's difficulties, his reputation and career were stronger than ever. Sometimes, David thought, the worst situations can lead to the best opportunities, and sometimes standing up for what's right even when it's difficult is exactly what opens the door to a better future.